Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome to our Curious Amalgam. I'm Alicia Downey, and the title of today's episode is, Does a Year Make a Difference? The Regulation of Influencers under the 2023 Revised FTC Endorsement Guides. You don't have to be on platforms like YouTube, Instagram, or TikTok for very long before you'll start seeing people recommending products or services that someone your age or with your particular interests might want to buy. An important component of U.S. consumer protection law includes the regulation of endorsements, a form of advertising where someone other than the seller of a product or service, such as an athlete, a celebrity, or a social media influencer, promotes that product or service. Today, we'll be talking about the Federal Trade Commission's guides concerning the use of endorsements and testimonials in advertising. These guides first issued more than 50 years ago, and they've been periodically updated since. As you'll hear in today's episode, the guides were significantly updated in June 2023 to reflect the new reality of the rising power and ubiquity of influencers on social media. So since it's been about a year since the newest guides were issued, we thought we'd take stock and ask a consumer protection lawyer with experience in this area whether the new rules are making a difference in the world of online endorsements. My co-host today is Matt Reynolds. Hi, Matt.
Hi, Alicia.
Would you like to introduce our guest and kick off the conversation?
Well, thanks, Alicia. Yes, we'd love to welcome Caiti Zeytoonian to our Curious Amalgam. Caiti is an antitrust and consumer protection lawyer in the Boston office of Morgan, Lewis & Bockius, where she represents clients in government investigations, enforcement actions, and private litigation related to restraints of trade, unfair competition, and unfair and deceptive trade practices. In addition to her busy practice, she is currently serving in a very important role as co-coordinator of the Antitrust Law Section's Young Lawyer and Economist Representative Program. Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, Caiti.
Thanks, Matt, and thank you, Alicia. Happy to be here.
Well, we're focusing today on how the FTC regulates the conduct of influencers. And I will say that, speaking for myself as the parent of a teenage son and almost teenage daughter, I am familiar with what an influencer is. But for those of us who are listening who don't hang out on social media every day, could you give us a sense of who is considered to be an influencer and what kind of behavior the FTC is trying to regulate?
Alicia mentioned the FTC guides concerning the use of endorsements and testimonials in advertising. And we can call those the endorsement guides for short because the title is way too long for the three of us to repeat over and over. Those guides really cover a broad range of conduct. When we're talking about influencer marketing specifically, we can think of the influencer marketing content as an endorsement and the influencer as the endorser. And to your question, what are influencers? Who are they? In our day-to-day, we encounter influencers on social media platforms. They work with brands to endorse products to a group of followers or an audience on behalf of those brands.
And to the second part of my question, let's talk a little bit about the type of conduct that the FTC is seeking to regulate with these guidelines.
The FTC's endorsement guides set out how to engage in influencer marketing in a way that is not deceptive. The guides themselves, to take a step back, reflect the FTC's interpretation of how Section 5 of the FTC Act, which prohibits deceptive advertising generally, applies to the use of endorsements and testimonials in advertising. Like any advertising content, influencer marketing needs to be truthful, not misleading, and capable of substantiation. All of the general truth in advertising principles apply to influencer marketing content. But the updated endorsement guides address some of the unique considerations that are presented with influencer marketing. When we think about traditional advertising, think of a commercial on TV that features a celebrity endorsing or promoting a product. We, as consumers, understand that there's a connection between the brand and the celebrity. The celebrity is being paid by the brand to promote the product. So if a film star is endorsing some type of food product in a commercial, again, we understand that there's a connection there. And so a disclosure is unnecessary because it's obvious to us that the celebrity is being paid for their appearance. But when we talk about influencer marketing, that connection between the brand and the influencer is not always so obvious. So when we have a prominent TikToker, for example, who's promoting a product in a way that seems genuine and authentic, it may not be obvious to consumers that there's a connection between the brand and the TikToker. And this concept is referred to as a material connection in the guides. And really, in layman's terms, it's a connection between the brand and the endorser that would impact or affect the weight or credibility that an audience gives to the endorsement.
You mentioned that some of these influencers, want to present themselves and the things that they're doing in an authentic way. And of course, authenticity is such a buzzword now for marketing. So are you saying then that this issue of disclosure of the connection between influencers and their brands is really the crux of the endorsement guides in this context?
For the purposes of talking about influencer marketing, certainly. I would say the need to disclose a material connection is one piece. And then the way that information is disclosed is another piece. So when we talk about the disclosure of an unexpected material connection, it needs to be done in a way that is clear and conspicuous. And these updated guides actually add a clear and conspicuous definition, which was not previously in the guides.
Alicia mentioned at the beginning of the episode that these guides have actually been around for decades, starting about 50 years ago. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of what their current status is? For example, are they binding in any way? Are they simply guidelines?
The guides themselves are not binding. They are, again, an interpretation, the FTC's interpretation of how Section 5 of the FTC Act applies to certain conduct. In this instance, the use of endorsements and testimonials in advertising. Although the guides don't technically have the force of law, failure to comply is not without repercussion. And we can talk about this a bit more. But the guides really are the rules of the road, and they're considered the principal source of guidance on this conduct. And the FTC actually proposed a related rule shortly after the release of the guides.
Caiti, you mentioned a moment ago that the new guidelines add a definition of clear and conspicuous. Are there other changes or additions that are particularly significant?
Certainly. So the endorsement guides themselves cover the use of endorsements or testimonials in advertising generally, and that is a wide range of conduct. And prior to 2023, they hadn't been updated since 2009. So there are lots of notable changes. And I'm hesitant to say that any are unimportant, but I will say for our purposes, when we talk about influencer marketing, the ones that stick out to me are this addition of the clear and conspicuous definition, as well as I would say an expansion of the material connection standard and an expansion of what an endorsement is. So I can talk about both of those. First, material connection. As we discussed, influencers are required to disclose unexpected material connections. The 2009 guides described an unexpected connection as one that is not reasonably expected by the audience. The updated guides change this up a bit. They tell us that a material connection needs to be disclosed when a significant minority of the audience for an endorsement does not understand or expect the connection. And the updated guides provide a non-exhaustive list of examples of what a material connection is. So the obvious one here is compensation, an influencer being paid. But the updated guides also recognize that a material connection can be something else. It can be free or discounted products, early access to products, free entry to events, a paid trip. It can even be a business relationship, a family relationship, a personal relationship. So it really expands the scope of what a material connection is. And finally, what is an endorsement? The guides themselves have really made clear that an endorsement is not just a post on social media. It can also be something as simple as a like or a tag or a hashtag. So we're really seeing endorsements taking a new form. And that is in response to the rise of influencer marketing. One other point I will make is on the clear and conspicuous piece. This is something that I think influencers and brands are grappling with in real time. Traditionally, on a static social media post, disclosures needed to be above the fold. This term actually comes from newspapers. We used it when we talked about the upper half of the front page. Something above the fold was in a prime spot for a story to get exposure. Now, above the fold means in a place where viewers can see it without having to scroll. So on Instagram, for example, we sometimes see influencers placing disclosures in the description of an Instagram post. But when people view Instagram streams, often only the first 2 or 3 lines are visible. So if you need to click more to see the disclosure, it's likely not adequate under this clear and conspicuous standard. And the same goes for live posts that include an audio and a written component. The updated guides tell us that to be clear and conspicuous, the disclosure needs to match the medium in which the representation was made. So if a representation is made both visually, in text, and verbally or audibly in the video, the disclosure needs to be both visual and audible.
The guides have been out now for about a year as we're recording this. And so the title of the episode was, Does a Year Make a Difference? So that's what I'm going to ask you next. What kind of enforcement activity have we been seeing since the guides issued? Who has the agency been going after, if anybody, under the new standards?
It's a great question. So in preparing for our discussion today, I tried to isolate enforcement activity that has occurred since the guides came out last summer. In November 2023, the FTC sent warning letters to trade associations and give or take a dozen influencers regarding social media posts that lacked adequate disclosures on Instagram and TikTok. So they seem to be coming out hot. I will say there's not been a ton of FTC activity since that November 2023 action. We have seen the National Advertising Division release decisions related to influencer marketing. I think if we look beyond this past year, the FTC has filed a considerable volume of cases involving allegedly deceptive endorsement practices in recent years. And in 2021, the FTC put over 700 companies on notice of potential civil penalties for engaging in certain deceptive practices relating to endorsements. And while I'm hesitant to draw any sweeping conclusions, I think we can anticipate continued scrutiny in this space. The release of the guides themselves, coupled with the FTC's release of a proposed trade regulation rule that would prohibit certain types of deceptive conduct that's addressed in the guides, signals to us that more enforcement action is likely coming.
That then leads us to the next question, which is how are we supposed to comply with these guides? I took a look at them myself. The guides are written basically by lawyers for lawyers. Has the FTC generated anything that's addressed to influencers themselves or the brands that hire them?
So in addition to the guides themselves, which do contain some very helpful examples and hypotheticals, the FTC released an updated FAQ document that includes additional questions and updates to information and answers. It adds specific guidance for influencers on when and how to disclose material connections across different kinds of platforms. And the FTC also has guidance for social media influencers themselves, specifically Disclosures 101 for social media influencers, which is an accessible brochure that outlines when and how to make disclosures.
So nobody has any excuses. I actually looked at you call them frequently asked questions or FAQs. It is, if you go on the FTC website, you can find these questions and answers pretty easily, but they go on and on and on. I mean, you'll scroll for 15 minutes. But I guess they added 40 new questions is what I understand
right.
to the existing set. So there's the answer to the question. There's a lot of resources on the FTC's own website for anybody who isn't even sure they have to comply.
It would be interesting for me to see how they've tried to roll out information about the new guidelines and these new FAQs on social media. So we've talked so far now about the FTC's guidelines, and one thing that comes to mind is whether or not there are other regulatory schemes that might be implicated in the kind of conduct we're talking about when it comes to endorsements by social media influencers. Are there also, state law issues that influencers should be on the lookout for that might parallel the FTC guidelines?
Nothing exists in a vacuum. At the state level, every state has some form of a consumer protection statute. These often take the form of unfair and deceptive practice statutes and are usually modeled on the FTC Act. And many states have false advertising laws. Of course, the level and scope of regulation varies from state to state based on statutory language, case law, and legislative priorities. But it's important to be mindful of all state laws and conform business practices to ensure compliance with all states. State laws that prohibit false or misleading advertising can apply to influencer marketing. And we've actually seen at the state level lawsuits filed under a state's Deceptive and Unfair Trade Practices Act that involved allegations of misleading or deceptive influencer marketing practices.
We're talking about an area of law then that's relatively new. We see it evolving, given that the FTC felt the need to engage in extensive updating. As a lawyer who works with clients who may be engaging influencers, what is your role in both ensuring that they are up to date on the law, but also that they even understand what the law is?
It's been a very fun time to work with companies because this is, like you said, a sort of new form of advertising that not everyone is familiar with. So I think there is some education that's happening both for marketing personnel as well as influencers themselves who are being engaged by these companies. So I would say, first, it's essential to confirm that influencer contracts exist. Do you have contracts with influencers? And if you do, are they adequate? Updating influencer contracts, updating influencer guidelines, helping to reevaluate and audit internal and external advertising policies. All of this is part of a broader compliance effort.
also, along the lines of my prior question, obviously you said, nothing occurs in a vacuum. A lot of these influencers obviously have influence across borders. I can say that my own children, I think some of the YouTubers they watch most frequently are based in Australia and then the UK. Are there any non-US laws or guidelines that are operating in the same space that influencers and companies need to be aware of?
So, like you mentioned, influencer marketing is not specific to the US, and regulation of influencer marketing, likewise, is not limited to the US. Non-US jurisdictions are actively regulating influencer marketing. By way of example, France implemented a law last year specifically governing influencers, which mandates the use of specific disclosures. Earlier this year, Italy approved new rules aimed at improving transparency on social media posts. And the Advertising Standards Council of India recently updated their influencer guides. I could go on and on about all of the non-US guidance that exists in this space, and there is a lot. So you raise a great point. The nature of the platforms on which influencer marketing occurs are not specific to one jurisdiction. And so oftentimes US laws and non-US laws are being implicated when we talk about influencer marketing.
I'd be interested to know if the FTC's guidelines give any particular attention to the target age of the audience that the influencer is typically watched by. Again, as the parent of a teenage and preteen who spends a lot of time on social media, that's sort of an interesting point for me to think about.
The endorsement guides actually address this point. They establish that not every audience is the same. So children and teens can react differently to a post than adults might. And so a disclosure that works with adults might not work with children. For advertisers and endorsers, this creates an issue because you do not have control over who your audience is. And so you need to craft a disclosure that is adequate and effective for every potential audience member.
I did glance at these guides before we recorded. It seems to me too, and I just want to make this clear for listeners, it doesn't matter whether the influencer is addressing their content toward followers or to, as you say, audience members, people who just happen across a post that is visible to them. They have the same responsibility to everybody in their audience. Do I have that right?
That's correct. Where an influencer's account is public, they are presumably speaking or advertising to not only their followers, but anyone who might encounter the content.
Well, the other great theme of the guides I took away was, at least the Q&As too, is when in doubt, disclose.
Yes, I am always a fan of erring on the side of caution and having the disclosure everywhere possible. Of course, this is a balancing act because influencer marketing is advertising. It's promotional content. And so oftentimes the lawyer comes in and wants to add a paragraph that
kills the vibe. Just kills the vibe, right? Yeah.
Yes. So one part of consulting on influencer marketing that I really enjoy is trying to find that balance, finding something that is compliant, but also doesn't make the marketing team want to cry.
Well, thank you, Caiti. All of this was most informative, and I just want to let listeners know that we'll be posting a link to the guides and the FAQs and Disclosures 101 on the webpage for this episode. So I recommend everybody take a look. The guides themselves it's not a very lengthy document. But before we let you go, Caiti, we're going to do what we do with every other guest and ask you a few questions to get to know you a little bit better. So first, can you tell us something interesting about yourself that is completely outside of your professional life?
Well, I don't know that it's completely outside of my professional life, but I do have a daughter. She is just under 8 months, and she is the love of my life. I admittedly have read drafts of work product to her, so I can't say that she's entirely removed from my professional life, but she is just an absolute joy and definitely puts things in perspective as well, to Matt's point. When you're thinking about advertising and you're thinking about advertising that's targeted at children, it's an interesting time.
Let me just say that it's a whole different experience now going on shopping trips with my kids as opposed to, before they were active on social media.
Well, that is very interesting. And I assure you, as the mother of a daughter myself, it's only going to get more and more and more interesting as life goes on for you. And then the final segment of our show is a little game we call the Curious Hat.
And now it's time for the Curious Hat.
The rules are extremely simple. Matt is going to draw a random surprise question out of a virtual hat. So take it away, Matt.
Your Curious Hat question today is, do you like to cook? And if so, what is your favorite dish to make?
I do like to cook. I don't do it as much as I should. But I am a fan of trying to recreate my grandmother's recipes, which are mostly Italian, eggplant parm, chicken piccata, all of these delicious meals that I would love to master but have not yet, but I'm working on it.
Are there any secret ingredients that you found are particularly helpful for those?
Butter.
Oh. All right. Well, thank you for that fantastic tip. Thank you for the fantastic conversation today. Thank you, Matt, as a wonderful co-host. Listeners, tune in for next week's Our Curious Amalgam.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.